It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Shubra. Shubra is an architect and educator working in environments that engage with diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying skills, from interior design and architecture to creative urbanism and conservation. Her work is directed through finding design trajectories from within the context of each project through the lens of profound relationships that remake the conventional rather than of the expressive shape and space making. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Yes, yes, my pleasure. No, thanks again. I
Shubhra,
always
Mysore School of
uh,
Architecture wholeheartedly welcomes you. Okay, and you have been a natural choice, especially for storytelling and narration. I think even all our faculty, because we have started doing this faculty development program, calling different people. I think it's very, very important. Be it junior faculty or with experience, I think we all have so much more to share with each other and
yes,
things like that. So
I
this is
agree.
where you come as
No, no,
part
I
of our.
agree. And I think thank you again for inviting
Yeah,
me. And I think let's keep this in the spirit of sharing rather than
yeah.
expertise and lecture,
Yes.
etc., etc. But yeah, I was actually quite thrilled when Safiya said that uh, perhaps you're interested in maybe talking and discussing about how to be more engaging. I think whether with students or with their projects, and so that even their sense of architecture becomes something that is beyond just application of skills or expressing themselves. And in a way, they begin to find a purpose or a meaning, which is beyond just subjective, I like this and you like that, and something that is something that makes them feel, makes us feel that we are all in this sharing something. So I think in that spirit, I'll share with you some thoughts, which is always what my talks or presentations are about. They are thoughts based on as I practice, whether I practice teaching or building. So the thoughts I share are not a theory per se, but they are really reflections and experiences. And obviously, it goes without saying, I gain as much from the dialogue that follows as preparing these. So with that, I'm going to start. Um, and I have called, yeah, now I'm going to 1 second, huh? Share. Yes. Entire screen share. And, yeah. So I'm going to start by basically sort of saying that the title really is a constant thinking, basically, on a play of word on the word lie. In terms of, we often ask ourselves when we get a site or when we get a project, when we get a client brief, or when students get our studio brief, you have the list of requirements, the situation, that is site coordinates, etc., etc. But over and above all of that, whether it's functionality or whether it's location, over and above that, where does the architectural project, which is the project for the architect beyond the client, reside? So lie in that sense also, but also where does it sometimes mislead us, whether in terms of taking typology too seriously or taking just quantitative data and information that we ask our students to gather too seriously. So I often find that oftentimes the project actually resides somewhere else. And how do we begin to get to the heart of that? The essence of that is really why um, uh, uh, the sort of reverting to finding a way to find a narrative structure in our process is important. And without sort of becoming too precious about the profoundness of these words, etc. Very simply, what that means is that in human terms is the ability for us to share our observations, our experiences, and make relationships between them. So I always like to say that one of my favorite sort of Greek gods, because the Greek pantheon is as rich and diverse as our pantheon of gods, and they are also rich with mythology. And mythology, of course, talking about stories, help us to make certain intangibles that surround us and that of which we are part of. They make them tangible. That's the role of mythology, right? They make certain relationships manifest. So in that spirit, one of my favorite Greek gods in the Greek mythology is a goddess called Hestia, not as well known as Zeus or Athena or um, um, uh, uh, the other gods that are well celebrated, but she is the goddess of the hearth. Hearth is the center of a house, basically. Hearth is where the fire is. Hearth is where we cook. Hearth is also where we come around fire. So, in a sense, whatever our ancestry, whether we're Indian, whether we are Greek, whether we are Eskimo, whether we are whatever it is, this is where we are brought together. So, Hestia is just a Greek expression of that human need to come together um, by warmth and also by communion with each other, right? And to share stories, perhaps of things we don't have a sense of control of or do not yet understand. And if you think a classroom is also, in a sense, a sort of a hearth, a project is also a sense of where we come together. So always I like to think of whether it's a classroom or whether it's a construction site or whether it's a meeting room, conference room with a client. These are various types of hearts where we are actually coming together rather than a place like a stage where we are there to perform, to show our expertise. That is only one subset of this coming together. And I believe architecture is the material expression of this. This, what you exactly see in the picture, this idea and the need, the human need to come together, which means that the principles of architecture are not compositional. It's not a visual discipline, but it's humanistic. That is, it's not quantitative. This degree sun, or this is the sun chart, wind pattern, temperature, humidity control, or this material, that material. It's not quantitative, the DNA of architecture, but it is relational. East as related to, let's say, a human activity of getting up. West as related to hot sun, or north in the northern hemisphere as related to really, really cold winds. And when we begin to make these relational connections, stories develop, but also our own sort of understanding of what needs to be done grows out of these relational circumstances. Data by itself is meaningless. And I always like to talk to my students this way. So the narrative that Safiya was talking about is basically this. They're not stories for the sake of stories. They're not in order to showcase my imagination or showcase the brilliance with which I can, the linguistic brilliance with which one can tell stories. But at the heart of it lies making connections. So as an example, to just start off, because my bases are two, one is in the American Southwest in Denver and one is in India, this is closer to my US base. And it's a place called the Chaco Canyon. And this particular structure is a structure called the Pueblo Bonito. In Spanish, Pueblo Bonito means a pretty town. But it is actually like a ritual center. It's thought of, archaeologists are now beginning to realize. Think of it kind of like a temple complex. In terms of its location, as I said, the sort of precinct, let's call it, lies at the base of a escarpment. Escarpment is a steep cliff. So I'm standing on top of the steep cliff and looking now towards the south. That's the orientation, and that's just the lay. The round structures are called kivas. They are thought to be ritual, congregational sort of spaces that were actually in the Pueblo culture. There used to be roofs on it, and you actually entered the space from above through a ladder. And this is just to show you where in the US, the Pueblo Bonito is located. In the Chaco Canyon is the larger valley. Now, it's very interesting that if you see, in terms of its orientation, there's a very strong orientation where it's a semicircle, it seems, with an east-west orientation. And one begins to wonder that it's a ritualistic sort of center, a place where the people of the Pueblo lived everywhere, but this is where they congregated to come together. And instead of a sphere that we see in many sort of temple structures, etc., instead of a closed sort of a shape, a form, what you see in plan is an organization which is a semicircle. And my father used to have a wonder, because he used to go to teach at the University of New Mexico, and this was one of his favorite structures. So even as children, this was a very dear structure to him. And one of the things that he liked to sort of, a story that he made to make this sort of plan composition and its orientation comprehensible to us and him, perhaps, is that he said that as a ritual place, the other half of the circle was completed by the path of the sun. Every day, the sun would rise from the east, set in the west. So always in this culture, the expression of which we find in its architecture is one where they understood that it takes something beyond yourself to complete yourself. It's a very different way of inhabiting the world than one where we build something complete, and therefore there is no place for any other thing to enter it. I like to think of this as a way to inhabit the world relationally. Therefore, every day you're reminded by the sun path, by the path of the sun, that there is something beyond yourself you always need to sort of be with, play with, etc., etc. And even what a wonderful way of thinking about religion as well, no? That you're always, in a way, always a part of something. You need something else to complete yourself. Whether or not factually this is exactly precise or not, this is the role of stories and narratives. As soon as you bring something else in relationship, through your story, a certain sense of inhabiting the world is presented, is clarified. And that really is the role of the story. So with that, I'm going to talk about the first project, since this, after all, was a story I heard from my father. This was a project done by Anant Raje around 1991. I choose this project not because this is typical of the material or the language with which he built, Adobe and mud bricks. Nor was it sort of chronologically the first project or early projects or later projects. But what I just talked about in terms of an attitude through which to practice is exemplified in this tiny little project, which is really a sort of a structure that was done for a very close family friend. And it was meant for a place where the bride's family receives the groom's family. So it's at a threshold. and it's where the Bharat, as we call it, in the north, is received. Now, what Raja has done is he locates it under the canopy of a mango tree, which you see already. So the mango tree completes the structure in terms of the shelter above. And of course, so one accommodation is it sort of locates itself under the mango tree, and the shape, which is this sort of cylindrical shape that you see, is also another kind of connection he seems to be making with the cylindrical platonic solid with the cuboidal platonic solid, because after all, this precinct was the Shodhan Villa, the Shodhan house, where Corbusier's Shodhan house, the house is one of the platonic solids, a cube. So to the cube, Raje brings a cylinder. So you have a conversation going on both ways with certain physical attributes in terms of the mango tree, both circumstantial, but the architectural beginnings begin from a conversation rather than some isolated concept that then is brought and shoehorned into the site. The concept originates from the site, and the manner in which you pick up things from the site has that narrative structure because it is conversational, relational in that sense. This is just the site plan. So what you see is the two cylinders that you see is the wedding wall. And it's also happily at the bend of the driveway, because the driveway is at the bottom. That's where the street is, the bottom of the screen. So as you come up, that's the threshold, which is momentarily expressed as that cylinder. This is just some of his sketches of where whatever I just said is made manifest. Now, interestingly, even in terms of the form, now another sort of conversation begins. So first we had certain conceptual conversations, both with Corbusier, so at an abstract level, then at a real level with the mango tree and the shade that the mango tree provides, naturally forming a roof. So the location of the project is also found. So two ways where the project resides is discovered. Finally, there's a material conversation. So look at the scales of engagement as well. So this narrative, this conversation, this relational practice engages all scales. It doesn't stop at concept or idea. Now here, the cylinder is broken into two. A, because as I said, it is a pass-through, right? It is a threshold, it's a stoop in terms of its functionality. So people have to be able to pass through. Second, it's slightly asymmetrical, but there are two arcs that allow it, and then the sectional profile is one where, because this was made on an existing driveway and you didn't want to disturb it because it is an ephemeral structure, temporary as we call it, because it's for the wedding and then it goes away. So if you had to disturb the driveway in order to dig a foundation, etc., you're going against the spirit of the site and the context. So what Raje does is the profile, the sectional profile and the plan profile automatically understands structural forces and allows the structure to support itself. So it's almost like the foundations, instead of being under the ground, themselves rose up and made the architecture, the form of the a project. And of course, the finish is where Raje steps back and the family, all the women, etc., participate in finishing. This was mud plaster. These are mirrors because it's in Gujarat. Abhlas, as we call it, is a common form of celebration and decoration of something. And they also become this incredible expression in terms of, during the actual event, when you put all these lights, diyas, lamps, etc. Anyway, so the final form is an outcome of many conversations. As architects, that's what's really what I wanted to share with you guys. And of course, After the wedding, because this was all mud brick, etc., adobe, within two monsoons, the structure began to sort of gently wash away. And in about 2 years, the driveway returned to what it was. And, life went on as usual in the precinct. So that is one sort of way of um, talking, thinking about what relationships are, but also where the architectural project um, is only completed by the inclusion of context rather than, in a way, separating oneself from it, and only foregrounding our project with the context as a backdrop. Now, I'll give you another example of what I mean by where intentions are the same as what we have so far seen in the two examples of the Pueblo Bonito and also the wedding wall. Intentions are noble, but where we may go a little, we miss something. So this is, and this sort of the story I'm going to share with you arose out of a studio exercise that I give my students about critiquing their favorite building. Because as I learned from my mentor and dear friend, Kevin Lowe, the most we learn is from the limitations or the failures or the missteps in our icons, our heroes, and our projects, not from the successes. Because the successes are kind of like a dead end. Somebody has already solved something. We don't know what to do with it anymore. But from failures, we can learn what not to do or how to better our practice. So we often start our studios not by case studies for successes, but actually case studies in terms of looking at the limitations, what we might learn from somebody else's missteps. So one student had brought this Auroville temple as her favorite project. So what follows is a discussion that we had that led her to be able to analyze and critique this project. So it's really a project that was born out of my teaching. Now, so we all know, and this form, it's resplendent in a sense. It's got a brick base, almost like petals that have either opened up or in a way closing, etc., etc. It's a perfectly symmetrical form, which is important to understand. And more importantly, the brick petals that you see surrounding the 360 degree of the main sort of congregation hall, that is in that gold-plated discs, are also given, as their website suggests in the Matra Mandir, certain sort of symbolic associations with the colors that we find in nature, right? And each one of the petal is a meditation room, and the architects as well as the sort of people of Auroville have also made these associations of, light blue is sincerity, deep blue is peace, etc., perhaps suggesting that these colors evoke some of these feelings in us. Now, what happens is, and this is the architecture of it, you have the red room, you have the orange room, you have the green room, etc., right? I'm going to hide this. Oops, sorry. I don't want to stop presenting. I'm really sorry. Yeah. Of the meditation rooms. Now, in some sense, this makes us think, therefore, no matter where in the 360 degrees the project is, a green room will always be green, a red room will always be red, right? And whenever you enter a red room, you're not allowed to feel anything other than what red feelings evoke. So we began asking ourselves in the studio, where do associations come from? These associations of blue is this and red is this, etc. Because we thought in asking this question, which is a relational question, Um, there might be something in order to point us to what direction the critique, the examination of a building might go, might approach. This is not in any theoretical framework, etc. It comes from just paying attention to the built reality and beginning to ask questions. Asking, framing questions is just as creative. Um, and so we began talking about, okay, what is the history? What is the history of our association with colors? And obviously, one of the first things we went to are sort of impressionists, because the impressionist painters like Claude Monet, because they were supposed to almost have been painting with light, if you, I mean, you know, if you read art history. So suddenly another discipline comes in to our sort of thinking space to begin to help us further refine and further sort of probe into this question of where do associations come from? Because color, after all, is a manifestation of light interacting with things at various times of the day and various times of the season. So even colors, when you make it a relational condition, have a range rather than a fixed color chip. So it was something very profound. And what we realized is Impressionists never did one painting of a scene. They did, you know, summer, winter, spring, autumn, and then different times of the day. In fact, Claude Monet, the same painting, Haystacks, he was doing for 2, 3, 4 years and having iterations after iterations, because he was trying to understand light, not to reduce light to colors like paint chips, but he was trying to sort of explore what does actually understanding light mean. And you begin to see, just when you see his entire sort of series of the same site, that he is beginning to understand the relationship between light, color, time, season, which means sun and our relationship with the sun. The materials on earth, their relationship with the sun. That is what light allows us to understand. It's not just about a beautiful shadow here or a lovely sunset there, but at the heart of it is this profound relation with the sun. Same with his water lilies. Apparently, he has done like hundreds of paintings of the same pond in his backyard. I mean, this is how, when you want to study light, we have that even in our language and in our folklore. So coming back to narratives, can be in the visual medium, narratives develop, but also in folk tales. This is a sort of a video, from a trip I had taken to Painch, one of the national parks in Madhya Pradesh. And at sundown, we were sitting at the edge of this pond, and all these sort of cows were coming back to the village. And one of my fellow sort of travelers who we had gone, we were about 4 or 5, suddenly said, yeah, this is what they mean by Godhuli. Now, Godhuli in Hindi means many things. It's a color. It's a particular type of color, kind of lightish pink, salmon pink, but you can't really pinpoint it. But it's also a state of mind, because the term for that particular color came from the time of day, dusk, not only the sunset, not only that, it comes from the fact that Godhuli, go is cows, that cows are returning home invariably, right, after grazing the whole day. And when they come, they kick up dust, because all their hoofs and all of that. And it's that dust kicking up, interacting with the setting sun, that gives rise to that particular kind of color. It's always a kind of color, never an absolute color. So the word, when you begin to sort of think about it, crosses so many senses and so many relationships. It's a color, but it's a time of a day, but it's also a phenomena. So the heart, but what we tend to do is we reduce it to Pantone color tones, right? We sort of feed this into an app and say, what are the color combinations? and therefore forever the sky becomes Pantone 13 1106 or something, or um, um, uh, the brown, whatever. But you see what I'm trying to say with this, that it is suddenly our relationship with this, the world, the phenomena, the place, the time, dusk, is reduced to a number of paint chips forever fixed. And therefore, it begins to become a prescriptive way of inhabiting the earth, where the designer tells you how to feel through codifying associations. And this is what we are very comfortable with, because this codification then can travel from one student to the other, one architect to the other, forever permanent. And you sort of, the entire architecture becomes an act of appropriation, where you extract formal association, but in that what happens is that we completely lose connection with its relational principles. Now imagine if these architects had, in fact, rather than making completely closed chambers and using artificial colors or even lighting to make mood rooms of red, yellow, etc., they had used the orientation and the 12 quadrants with specific ways of making openings. So at different times of the day and in different season, the sun enters and colors the room in different ways. Then each day of the year, for the 24 hours, when you enter it, you are allowed to feel what the sun, what the season allows you to feel. That sort of a relationship is one which never allows you to forget that ultimately, no matter what spirituality you follow, no matter what cult leader you follow or religious diktats that you ascribe to, they are not self-sufficient in themselves. That's what our relationship with the world ends up becoming if it becomes prescriptive and codified. But if it remains open and relational, then we always understand that we are forever linked to the basic blocks of context. It's as simple as that. The sun, the wind, the seasons, etc. All these things that we tell our students to be mindful of, in terms of sustainable building, this, that, and the other, actually now are tied into just such a human way of looking at the world, right? And each time then is a rediscovery of what our own architecture can produce. So a relational practice, a relational way of understanding the world, and therefore our role as architects in it, allows us to sort of, in a way, discover the underlying principles of the associations with each experience, rather than reduce an experience to certain prescribed codes. So a soft red can also evoke not just anger, but sometimes maybe warmth. And the sun allows you to remember these other associations, which completely get wiped out with color theories and all other kinds of skill-based, expertise-oriented ways of practice. So let's look at, in a way, how this relational understanding affects a simple project like a school project. It affects programming and our understanding of also the aesthetics of use, our understanding of what function means. So this was a project that I had done in Western Orissa, in a place called Jharsuguda. And in the context of the school now, again, talking about codes and codifications, the typically efficiency demands, because, schools, just like multifamily housing, there are some hospitals, there are certain project types that often operate on very tight budgets. their margins of error, their factors of sort of safety, whether it's cost-wise or any others, are very, very small. And even me, I would much rather want whatever money my client has, especially let's say if it's a school client or something, I would much rather they spend it in operations, paying their teachers, building new programs, than only in the looks and feel of my building. So of course, efficiency is important. And typically, an efficiency demands a double or a single loaded corridor, right? This is, I'm showing a single loaded corridor double, which is a simple thing, circulation one way and rooms along one or two sides. Now, what we did was the same 5 classrooms. What we did was we swung 2 classrooms 90 degrees. So we still have a single loaded corridor, but by swinging it, we found that central space that you see. And for us, it was an outdoor room, a legitimate room. And because if you see the diagram, the courtyard, which we generally like to call, was found, was discovered, and it was scaled to the functional entity of a classroom, if you see proportions. The non-programmed, which normally if you stuff a courtyard into a building typology of this sort, because it has no program, but it still needs to be built in one way or the other, begins to affect the cost margins, etc., etc. But here, the courtyard ceases to be a symbolic, aesthetic, or a technocratic, from a climate standpoint, entity within the plan, but because it has that particular scale of a classroom, because it was derived from the diagram of efficiency and not the diagram of an aesthetic or a typology, more importantly, which is if you're building in India, you build a courtyard typology. It gets tied to the activity, and therefore it becomes our 5th classroom. And therefore, it can never be removed from the project, because now we are building, client wanted 5 classrooms, we are giving him 5 classrooms, but that 5th classroom is a room without a roof, which is what that is. And then, the plan begins to develop. Now, that classroom, as you see in the diagram, can hold activity, but also works climatically, etc., etc. And then the same logic applies to another set of classrooms. One is a sort of an elementary to the left, and to the right is a preschool. So the plan, scale-wise and certain sort of articulation-wise, is different, but the logic remains the same. A central courtyard diagonally from bottom left to top right is a series of courtyards that allow wind, etc., etc., to pass through. And the architecture gets developed through that. So we don't impose a typology. The typology is discovered through a diagram of efficiency. And it's, of course, formalized through a series of linked courts around which small learning communities, classrooms, are organized. And at the same time, the end result is that each group of classrooms, each group of grades is built in a sense of Havelis, in that sense, because in kindergarten through 12th grade, kids grow very fast, and their sense of identity is important to preserve, because you grow in terms of age groups. This is something that behavioral scientists will tell you. And if you just have one giant school, then there is a feeling of alienation as kids develop, especially when they are like about 9 to 13 or something, the adolescent years. And also this way, the preschool, the really young kids have their own environment, but of course there are these open connections. So we are tying, again, just like the previous examples we saw of the Wedding Wall and Chaco Canyon, we are tying various scales of engagement, programmatically, behaviorally, etc., etc. Behavior, why? Because it's a school. School, it's not just a typology in terms of architects. It's also a place where kids grow and mature. Anyway, what what I really want to emphasize here, which I think I already have, is that it's important when we finally see the final plan that I never talk about this school, this project as a courtyard typology. Because even though the final plan evokes an archetype, this was neither the emphasis nor the genesis, as I've showed you, hopefully. Instead, we have looked to the nature of activities and the meaning of use to provide what I call an endurance, which is material, um, tangible, and a practice of the everyday. Now, what do I mean by that? That to achieve this, as an example, the interior and the exterior room, because they are proportionate to each other, hold equal value in the overall sort of programming of the school. And so if this diagram you see, each part is therefore used at different times of the day. The same thing that I've been talking about, let's say in Chaco Canyon in one way, or even the limitations of Matru Mandir in another way. We had found a way to address this so that you are in a way like a nomad in your own building. Charles Correa used to always like to say this, that you're nomads within your own building, and each part of the building, each part of your plan gets occupied again in relation to the sun and in relation to various cues, again the basic blocks of content: sun, wind, the path of the sun or the moon, etc., etc., provide you these clues. So some parts of the plan are um, uh, in a way pleasant to be occupied at certain times of the day, and certain others at certain other times. It's not all one size fits for all. It's always contextual. So that contextuality finds itself even in the manner in which use, activities, functions are woven into the diagram of the plan. Only then the plan will hold. This is the site plan, so to speak. But if you see these diagrams, we have built incrementally. These diagrams that you saw, these ones, are only the top phase, the first phase. Each time we added one unit of classrooms, we tied it with a activity that was communal. So again, even the plan development, the manner in which we understand a connector and make a relation to the most appropriate and relevant activity that lends itself to being a good connector, allows the connector not just to be a formal connector, but also a connector in terms of an activity. So the first increment, that when we added and the site plan grew, the dining or the multipurpose hall, the dining itself was a multipurpose hall, and I'll talk about this a little later, became the connector. The next was when the pool especially became a connector between a compound wall and the precinct of the site, so that the pool could be used by the school as a revenue generator, even for the larger town as well as their students. I won't go into the details of the plan, but so therefore each connector is what we call multivalent, doing more than one thing. And finally, on and on, the next set of connectors were the library and the lecture hall, etc., etc. The nature of one such connector, which if you see this one, and this one is located, if you see, I don't know if my cursor is seen, but it is next to, oops, sorry, I don't know in Google how to do it. In Zoom I could have. But anyway, this is in the preschool. What you're looking at is the courtyard. The other structure is behind you. So this is like an entrance space, a lobby space, etc., etc. So when I talked about always linking activity, programming, and also its location and plan and the generation of the plan, I consider the architectural program as an opportunity to bring what I call a friendly complicity, a convivial complicity between activities officially programmed and the ones that aren't programmed, such that they need each other's presence, that adjacency. It's not just a bubble diagram. It sort of is a material, tangible connection. a complicity that engages us in the search for a greater economy of means. Why? Because if you build less, it costs less, it uses less materials, which means every space needs to do more than one thing. But that doesn't mean it's a multi-flexible, or whatever the terminology is, bound by four rooms. No, the multivalency comes, in fact, from the location it occupies in a plan, which is relational again. So we'll keep going back to that, because the best stories are the ones that make the best relationships. Anyway, so what you see here is the entrance lobby to a school, to the preschool. But it is also where meals are had, because we encourage students, and I do this, I try to do this at least, in urban schools as well, where people eat on the floor. It's actually very healthy also, posture-wise. But the main thing is, after that, when the meals are finished, you just roll up the mats, take the dishes to the kitchen. In this case, the kitchen is to the right of your photograph, and sweep and mop the place. And now suddenly this place can also become a playground. You can bring some play equipment to it. You can hold a storytelling session, etc., etc. So suddenly what you see is that, this was in monsoons basically, where the play equipment from the outside courtyard was brought in. So it's an outdoor room. I'm sorry. So it's basically it's something which is also a dining room, a nap area, a play area, a lobby area. It's basically an indispensable area rather than a leftover area, which the client can say, no, we don't need to build this because it's a waste of space. So a lot of the times, our in-betweens are between functions, and therefore they are left over. And we expect our clients to pay for it. But if you infuse it with activity based on adjacencies in a plan and this relationship, then it becomes indispensable, and it becomes an integral part of the plan, rather than something us as architects have sort of asked the client to pay for, because in plan or as architecture, it looks good. So for us, it's important, because this, what I've been talking about, begins to define our ideas around efficiency and endurance. So to talk poetically doesn't mean to not address efficiency or functionality, etc. But everything through relationships becomes richer, because they overlap rather than are placed side by side, all these different attributes of an architectural project. And that's what gives something its endurance. It endures, it begins to become timeless. And so this is another view of that same courtyard looking the other way. And as you see, these courtyards become play areas, also impromptu classrooms if it's a really pleasant day, etc. And so the building itself, through its attitude to use, creates what I call the controls the user needs. In short, dealing effectively with context, everything climatically and programmatically, that's the context, right? Necessitates an inventiveness about living patterns, about activity beyond function. And when you start saying activity and not function, you automatically start talking about relationships. This attitude, a relationship with time, for instance. During lunchtime, it is a dining room. That is relationships. In the morning, it is something. That is relationship between time, what the sun is doing, so sun chart, and function. This attitude allows us to be, as I said, a nomad within the building, using different conditions of the built form. And the cycle of activity, played out day after day, reinforces patterns of living that generates the meaning of use, and finally the culture of a place. So when we talk about cultural identity in places like this, which is this is the town. Culture doesn't mean some romantic traditional past. It means, how do we as architects tap into what the daily routines are, and they become just as important as some romanticized past. So in the same town where the school was built, this is the main street of the town, the main market street. And you can see it's like any other town you and I live in. Sort of what I call anodyne, as in it's, if you want to be really critical about it, uncharacteristic. There's nothing that we remember or makes an impression. Billboards, but also rapid change in activity. One store it's here one day, it becomes something else another day. Now, in the beginning of 2020, we were approached by the same client as the one I had for the school. We were approached to do a small events pavilion for marriages and town assemblies, etc., on a street, on this street, but further down. And of course, it's a busy market street. So, from real estate standpoint, even though it's a small town, it's a prime location. And we were told that much like the high turnover of the shops, this pavilion that we were approached to design, events pavilion, may have a lifespan of about 10 years. Until the client figures out a more permanent function in terms of a revenue generator. So we were asked to build something that may or may not come down. Now, as architects, that you take it both in terms of a challenge, but also there's a little bit of, "Arey, mera kaam, my work will be demolished at some point." And it's paradoxical, right? Because we generally build for something to endure. We want it to endure. Anyway, so in a way, we began to think, like, what do we do? And this is the aerial drone view of it. And like most sites in India, the only characteristic thing of this site was a very precise and already made boundary wall. All of us as architects, it's a strange condition. At least I find it very strange, because architects love to hate walls. No, we always want to break to make connections and flow of inside outside or public private, etc. So we are always trying to erase the walls, and the clients, that's the first thing they end up building. As soon as they buy the plot of land, they build a boundary wall. And oftentimes the first sort of task of an architect is to build a gate. Anyway, so that was our condition, and we struggled to find anchors. But inadvertently, we found it in the name of the property, rather ironically called Bagichi. He had called it Aparna Bagichi. Aparna was his foundation. The school was also Aparna School, and this was going to be called Aparna Bagichi. I mean, he was imagining this to be a bagicha. Bagicha is a garden or a grove, basically, in Hindi. But anyway, so we began thinking, okay, this is rather sort of is promising, the idea, which is a garden behind a wall, because the boundary wall was there and he was trying to evoke Bagichi. So we started thinking about, this idea of a garden behind the wall. The wall has to be there to not allow the town to, take over the Bagichi. And yet, if any of you have walked over, or rather along a wall in your residential neighborhoods or anywhere where the garden behind is overflowing, it is like one of the biggest thrills, no? It somehow makes that walk for that little block of the neighborhood a little pleasant. You don't have to look into the garden. You don't have to look into the property. It could be a palace or a hut behind the property. But there is the sense of a little joy as we walk past it. So these became our sort of, in a way, contextual underpinnings. The quality and character we could bring to the street for that little bit of property. Then even our garden will be overflowing. Anyway, so we kept the garden, the boundary wall, we kept it, but we modified it a little at the top left corner in such a way, and we redesigned. So we didn't just give this over to the city, but we redesigned it in such a way, especially that gate, because like I said, it's the next thing that clients always want you to design. Na, ek acha sa gate bana do, which is like, announces what lies behind grandly. So we designed the pavilion itself became the gate. And so that gate notionally could be inhabited. A small pavilion straddling that which was within and without. Right? And in such a way, what we did was we added what you see. Go back. We added a porch to the pavilion. but the porch was in the language of a garden under the trees. And the garden was there by itself, such that the porch, especially the trees themselves, became the elevation for the garden and the pavilion, lending sort of a grace to the ceremony of arrivals and departures. And then, of course, the garden behind the gate with vegetation, trees, bougainvillea spilling over, etc., etc. So, you see what I mean by it. When the doors of the pavilion are closed, it's a gate. When the doors are open, the street flows into the garden, or vice versa, however you want to think about it. But also, more importantly, when the gates are closed, the porch offers some sort of pleasure of the garden behind to that busy market street. So these are the ways we were thinking. Really a small sort of, and I know I'm sort of taking a lot of time, but a small story in terms of that other scale of engagement, materials and details. Initially, we became like, we said, oh, we can do so much with this pavilion, because yes, it was dismantleable. So it needed to be dry construction, but we could still explore with steel. So we came up with these expressive sort of ideas that in a way evoked the sort of sinuous nature of a garden, etc., etc. And we felt very pleased with ourselves. And then the client looked at this and he went a little silent, and then he said, yeah, but now you have, just completely ruined my efficiency, because I will have to, these are all bespoke sections that I will have to spend a lot of money in it. So what we forgot in all our sort of, excitement about the garden and the structural expressiveness it could bring, etc., etc., we forgot the other context was this was going to come down in 5 years. And therefore, we needed to make use of whatever sections were available in the local market so that there's no transportation cost, no manufacturing cost, etc., etc. The client could simply build, and then at some stage when he needed to take this down, the pavilion basically, that is, he could sell the steel either by weight for scrap or be reused in some other way. So we just modified the section. Principally, the section did the same thing. It still had verandas on two sides in the pavilion in between. And this is what it was, that could then be adorned to whatever need it needed to. And this is the tree porch in the front. This is another view of the pavilion. And this is from the street, another view. So in a way, what my point here was that, and of course, the story here is, and this is just the final plan, etc., is that we do have agency, even in the most hopeless cases, to make sure that what is the most important part of the project will remain, and that is the garden and the wall. And we also made gabion walls instead of the boundary wall, etc., etc. But that's a minor detail. What you see here, the gabion wall and the thing, and whether the pavilion remains or goes away, the garden will always remain. And I have a suspicion the pavilion will also always remain, because once the trees take hold, it takes a very heartless man to cut it down. Anyway, so I like to include this story of the project as part of my discussions, because in it lies a certain sort of sense of what our agency as architects is, if again we learn to read the site and make the relevant connections with regards to what actually is the architectural project. The project was not the pavilion. The project was the garden. The client didn't say that. The client, for him, it was all about building that pavilion that he could rent out for weddings, etc., etc. But it's the role of the architect to choose what the emphasis of the project should be. And therefore, when we teach, it is our role to help students find these relationships in their projects, especially their design thesis projects, where they are tasked with finding a site and making a program. And this, of course, was the final sort of thing, which is under construction, etc. I'm going to end, therefore, going along this theme with, again, a very successful project. Hopefully, most of you know what it already is. It's the High Line in New York, very well celebrated, very well awarded. Um, uh, in fact, so popular now that every city almost wants its own High Line, so to speak. It's an exciting urban experience and a global development model, transforming an obsolete infrastructure and elevated railway line into a public park. But uh, as with the Matru Mandir, this was a project where we are looking actually at the limitations of this highly successful and celebrated case studies, rather than telling students, go study this if you want to do urban redevelopment or adaptive reuse or something. Really quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, but this is the lay of the High Line. It was when the High Line, the tramway, was built. It was built in a very industrial part of Manhattan. This is, we are talking about in the 1960s. That then once the industry changed, roads happened, railways became less and less, and all sorts of things. Manufacturing went out of Manhattan and were taken over by banks and galleries and things of that sort. Manufacturing went away, actually, onto the mainland. The High Line fell into disrepair, the elevated railway line, and was actually slated in the 90s to be torn down. And two recently sort of newcomers to this Chelsea meatpacking neighborhood, two recent sort of residents wanted to keep the High Line because when they went up, which was totally sort of, not allowed, but went up, saw that it actually was a meadow of wildflowers because it was undisturbed, right? Nobody could go there. And it was this wonderful green line that wove through this particular part of Manhattan. And using this photographs and many others, they also saw evidences of people from the neighborhood once in a while going there, either for a little romantic rendezvous or, in the winter, walking along it, etc. Basically moving away from the humdrum and the bustle of the city, but totally in an organic way. It wasn't sanctioned. They used these stories and anecdotes in order to fight for the keeping of the High Line. The mayor agreed. The community was also, saying, oh, yes, we're going to get a neighborhood sort of a park that everyone can enjoy. And that is how the project was floated. An international competition was initiated. And Diller Scofidio and Renfro, DS plus R, very famous firm, along with Pete Odolph, a planting designer, won and James Field Corner Operations, of course, a landscape designer, won the competition on a strategy of what they called agritecture, part agriculture, part architecture. In order to make their agritecture, they ripped out the whole wildflower, kept the railway tracks as some datum, as they called it, and reconstituted the park through these wonderful details of, an inspiration taken from railway sleepers, and cast these precast members that were always also the main hardscape where people could walk, but they also fingered like this beautifully to allow landscape to weave in and out of each other, kind of a thing, so sort of blurring the boundary, as they called it, between hardscape and softscape. And I mean, very sexy looking project, iconic details. And then they created these moments from which you could look out onto the neighborhood, viewpoints that looked into the neighboring buildings, etc., which at this point, when it was initially conceived, were all neighborhoods. And also little funky details they created, like this is the main entrance from the south end of the High Line. That was a play on the architectural section that, of course, all architects love. This is one of the most photographed view in architectural circles, because little inside joke kind of a thing. And of course, this is from their own website, the architects, heavily feted and celebrated, etc. Now, with all this, stories of successes, again, as I'd mentioned earlier, um, we had talked about this at one conference, and it's at that conference, this was one of my favorite projects. Kevin again challenged me during that conference about have you really looked at the High Line beyond what is just on the surface, the glitz and the glamour and all of that. And he encouraged me to really, along with him in a way, look at the High Line critically. And he showed me two series of photographs towards that end of critically examining something, just like we were doing in the Matru Mandir with the color and associations. Where do these sort of narratives of success come from? So he showed me this, which is a whole bunch of graffiti, and this. So this was before the High Line, this is after the High Line. That was one set he showed me. And the second was this. This was the neighborhood before the High Line. Little walk-up apartments, little mom-and-pop stores, little delis, rentals, shoe repair, key repair. This was the neighborhood. This was the community for which the High Line was supposed to be built. It was marketed that way. And this is what happened after. And he challenged me about it, saying that in a way, and he constantly challenges through a lecture he titles his lecture called Creative Entitlement. So once again, this to this and this to this. I don't know if you realize, in one case, graffiti, which is a very local art form, it's ground up, became sanctioned art, formalized graffiti. This is all commissioned art pieces. All the other social imaginations that go with graffiti, including the origins of graffiti, actually are linked to urban gangs. And the marks that you see, especially these, the writing is actually territorial markings of this is our corner, or this is our street, etc., etc. That gets flattened to just aesthetics. And of course, this I don't need to tell you as a group of architects, the diversity gets flattened to global brands and one kind of demographic. And of course, a demographic that as architects, we should be very familiar with, because we assume these are the projects that get celebrated in our magazines. Anyway, so what we begin to observe is that in addition to the transformation of the physical infrastructure of the elevated railroad itself into an urban park, there are layers of cultural transformation as well. And that cultural transformation, in fact, kicks out the very community the project hinged itself on in order to get sanctioned. So, and now it has become like a sort of a Disneyland of tourists, in fact. And only about 10 years later, you began to see, as you see, criticisms from the community about the project. The previous slide was titled Disney World on the Hudson. Hudson is the river. So somebody else is saying, I prefer to pay to a soup kitchen than pay for artfully arranged grass. Because what happens is the property values go up. And so these little mom and pop stores can't afford the property tax because their investment is in the physical shop or store or etc., etc. And therefore, they all had to sell this in order to go somewhere else. So their neighborhood, they can't enjoy. The politicians will tell you, but at least they got money out of it. But is that what is the only thing that is important? For places to endure and not just real estate. And nowadays, if you see, the High Line is only used by tourists. It's never used by the local. Anyway, there are hardly any locals left. So what ends up happening is that we, in celebrating an architectural piece, we don't question anything else that happens in terms of the human level, because we say, oh, that is not our problem. But it can be. And I'm going to end with how it can be. So 10 years before the High Line, Paris already had its version of a High Line, which was called the Promenade Plantée. It's a very silent project. On the left, you see the High Line. On the right, you see the promenade. It was also an aqueduct converted into an elevated park. I don't know if you see, this was an early photo of the promenade taken, but you already see one key difference, right? Which is the High Line is all just meadows, whereas the promenade already has trees growing in it. We'll examine it a little further. In the High Line, if you see, the architects created platforms and corners and lookout piers to peer into the neighborhood opportunistically. In the promenade, you see the clearings on the right side only at street intersections. When the promenade cuts through existing fabric, it is actually enclosed by trees. We'll see this further. This is just one view. Promenade on the one side is a commercial street, and on the other side is residential street. And unlike the High Line, the residential neighborhoods all along the promenade have remained. They have not become gentrified like Manhattan. And this is how the promenade looks between intersections, completely engulfed by greenery. Now, this is a design strategy. And you don't have a sense of the neighborhood at all. Not just that, the only points, like I said, where the clearing exists is either next to office buildings or when the residential, on the top left, you see, the residential fabric recedes from the promenade. So there's a little gap between the promenade and the apartments, so that at no point can you look into an apartment, which is, it's privacy ultimately, and thresholds, as we like to call it. The rest of the times, it's wooded and densely, and this is just one such where even the entrances to the promenade, unlike in the High Line, are from the side of the residential neighborhood, not from the commercial neighborhood, all along. And it's all these decisions, the vegetated enclosure, the clearing at the street intersections only, and entrances from the residential side. All these are born out of the specificity of the immediate surrounding, and it changes the nature of the typology. So the promenade, if you see in the previous slides, have all along its 5 miles or whatever, have different aesthetic strategies. Whereas if we saw in the High Line, it was one strategy, the designer brand of the architects and the landscape engineer was always there, all along. And the distinctions, therefore, between the High Line in New York and the promenade in Paris, now known more for the typological precedent, are, in a way, the differences are in how they chose to understand and work with their immediate urban context. The High Line in New York is a consequence of a creative will of the architects exerted to fundamentally alter the relationship of the surrounding urban fabric to it. The context was made a foil for the High Line to best express itself, which is a hybrid public space to experience nature, art, and design. And everyday life, which it now sliced through, became its spectacle. Something to enjoy by tourists. Oh, look, somebody's apartment. Oh, look, somebody's cooking there. Oh, look. So all the tourists become voyeurs to the theater of somebody's personal life. Totally, in a way, transgressing the public-private in a one-sided way. The residents have no choice but to, if they feel uncomfortable, they have to move out. They don't have a choice. And therefore, it's not a community park anymore. No wonder the context slowly changed to that which was spectacular in its own. Google and Tiffany's and all of that. People who like, again, to be spectacles, as the newly designed High Line entrenched itself. The promenade, what you see on the right, accommodated itself within the neighborhood. It was a park for the neighborhood, not to see the neighborhood from. The tactically diverse promenade, as we see here, its strategy all along its length is different based on the neighborhoods it traverses. That tactically diverse promenade is in quiet defiance of the globally celebrated strategies marketed by projects such as the High Line. And I'm not coming hard on High Line, I'm coming down hard on our profession, because this is what we teach. What is on the left is what we teach in our academies and schools of architecture, because they can be recognized and easily replicated. One is an example of the amplification of the project using context as a means to achieve that. The other, which is on your right, is the amplification of the context using the project as a means to do so. It's a profound shift in emphasis that we see resonate, whether it's in the Chaco Canyon, the same attitude of inhabiting the world, whether we see in that little wedding wall, whether in some way we see in the Jharsuguda school or the pavilion, the garden pavilion. So I'm going to end with this photograph, which I want you all to look very carefully at. It is not my photograph, nor did I first source it either. My first encounter with this photograph was in a lecture by Ilse Wolff. She's a wonderful architect from South Africa. In her lecture, and it's a photograph by a photographer called Paul Grendon of this lady who is building, called Katrina Mayet. Now, this image for me is very profound. I wanted to end our discussions today, on my lecture today, with this, because what you see here is that first thing I talked about, resonate, which is the principles of architecture are not compositional, but they are humanistic. They're not quantitative, but relational. What do we see in this photograph? That she is building around her possessions. In fact, if you see really carefully in the center behind the cupboard, you actually even see a family member there. So her family, her possessions are already there, and she is building in order to give them shelter rather than the other way around. Architectural education generally tells us we first design an empty space, an abstract space, composed perfectly wonderfully, all the principles of geometry and symmetry and etc., which we then later inhabit with furniture, with people, with appliances. Most importantly, therefore, what we are doing is we use the architectural project to inhabit it with our ideas. Our education and academies, and all of us are a part of it, orients us towards finding our own voice, no? That is what we understand as creativity, right? Our students must have our own voice. But you know what I've realized coming out of the academy, practicing, thinking, living in general, is that in reality, I have a voice only so that I can talk to someone else. Just having a voice by myself is of no use. This is the shift that I want to leave you all with. That we must make an architecture that's oriented otherwise, not towards us, but through us outside. And what this means is that we build with the resources that we have, but we understand the resources in relational terms, not quantitative terms, in the context that we find ourselves, not in data terms, but in relational terms. And you build around that understanding of relationships. And you also link it to, therefore, the kind of infrastructure that we have. But you build it with power and strength. I mean, look at her, in this photograph. She's all power, all purpose in that sense. And in the end, we reach the conclusion that the basic interaction with the world, just like her building her house, is not technical, but it is human, exquisitely human. And to acknowledge this way of inhabiting our context requires us to pay attention to it, to the context, with an intimacy, not a distance. And therefore, disciplinary guidelines and frameworks are always to be dismantled in the studio through the critique that I was talking about. That's why we use case studies to critique them, not to follow them blindly. It's a critical intimacy, full of sort of wanting to not just have overviews and generalizations and reductions like color palettes, to embrace the complexity of connections. Criticality in the critical intimacy brings with it a curiosity, pushing us to ask why things are the way they are. Intimacy gives rise to an empathy within us, allowing us an awareness of how these things that we begin discovering and why they are the way they are related to everything else and each other. That's what empathy brings. So, in critical intimacy, both are important. Only intimacy, we become touchy feely. Only criticality, it becomes too distant. But both together are what is important, and that's what the best stories. Because critical intimacy leads to a constant engagement with the world, that's what gives rise to the best stories and new stories, and from which new institutions are born. So I'd like to end with that therefore, to constantly, the most critical question you can ask when you embark on a project is, where should the emphasis, that's what is meant by the architectural project, where should our emphasis lie? So I think with that, I will end. I apologize if I've gone too long, and I will open to questions.
Yeah. So I can see myself. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. That was very insightful. Like I would like to start the discussion where we have a tendency to, like you were saying about codification, because we think about a space and then we say that okay, this is how a space should look like. When we are, like when the students are coming up with new things, we as teachers also have a tendency to go against it, saying that no, that is not how it looks like. So that way I think we are kind of limiting the the way the students are thinking. So
Yeah,
sometimes that sort of thing also happens as a teacher. Yeah. So another thing is about the context. We do definitely talk about the context, and we start engaging with the context and all. But in the process of designing, once it comes to the design, we tend to forget that part. So then it all becomes about the building itself.
yeah,
So there's
yeah,
no relation between the building and the context or the people who are going to be inhabiting that building. So I think as teachers, we all, I mean, have come across such situations, right? So if
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always like to give this example of uh, a school is a very interesting, simple project. So, especially during design thesis, I found that students as well as faculty always want to take the most seemingly complex projects, like an airport or I don't know, think of anything these days that people are designing, a museum, um, etc., etc. But even if you take the simplest project like a school, um, the way to ensure that you're constantly engaging with the context at each scale during the process of development is initially, of course, throw out what we understand as architects as the typology of a school. Because what we do as teachers is also saying, find other case studies of schools. But what if we say, well, what is a school? What is learning? So
yeah,
go to the heart and then begin to discover that, especially if they're not rich school, school is a resource which, when the school is not on, let's say on the weekends, the same playground can also be used for an events ground for the community it is in. The same library over the weekend. So what have I just done in this example? I brought in the element of time. So when we talk about spatio-temporal or whatever these words we use, but the meaning of it is very simple. That a school works 5 days a week, normally only from, let's say, 9 to 3. And when do people stop working? Around 5. So from 5 to 8, that school building or school precinct compound lies vacant. Now, if that becomes the beginning of understanding context, then the project itself assumes a direction that is not just about designing programmatically classrooms and library and dining hall and administration. And then the rest of the time, the effort is in making a funky form so that the end is projected as something innovative. But the fact that the innovation begins from the program stage and then is carried through, because then the materiality you need to design, let's say, even a compound wall, as I had illustrated, that our compound wall began to accommodate a full swimming pool, uh, because suddenly that was the threshold between the community and etc. Because the client wanted a swimming pool, but a swimming pool is the most expensive, just like an auditorium. These are very expensive programs for an organization to maintain. So it's something I didn't talk about in the lecture, but that dimension also comes in. So when we are programming, the programming part is the first act of creativity, because we are engaging with the context at an intangible level, but are making these associations. The same thing comes down to material, for instance. In our studios, when we make material choices, so far, we talk in terms of either technocratic, so a student wants to investigate, explore detailing, and the project becomes a vehicle to explore that, or we look at it in terms of sustainability, etc., which is, certain materials are associated, almost like film stars and the kind of movies they make, like that. Certain materials mean something, versus whether bamboo grows in that area or not. Anything made with bamboo is sustainable. These kind of associations creep in. Just like Matru Mandir color theory, we also have material theories now that remain uncritical. But if we bring in now relationally the element of weathering and the act of maintenance, you begin to think of material in a completely different way. An example: normally we say, even in our own practices, maintenance free materials, because that's what our clients want, right? I don't want to maintain it every day. But if weathering um, um, compulses us to come back every year to maintain, that cycle of maintenance gets tied to another cycle, maybe of a festival, or if it's a school, it could be linked to a school ending or a school beginning, maybe fundraising. So the community, through material upkeep, renews its relationship with the institution, the architecture of which is just the material expression of the institution. Now, we made a social imagination link to a humble material. So the material choice in a student project doesn't remain associative. It becomes foundational to reinforcing the concept they began with, which is a school is also a community center. So a small project like that can be rich at all levels of engagement. And that's how stories begin to emerge, even of a project. And therefore, at no scale of engagement, in student terms, in terms of the weeks, first week, midweek, mid semester, or last 2 weeks of the semester, are you at any time distant, forgetting the concepts with which you started? So, concept doesn't mean that first sketch has to be evidenced in the form, but it's this: what relationships did you begin with, and how do those inform all choices, from how your plan is to how the nature of boundaries are, to how your material choices are, reinforces that concept. And that is the narrative of a project, not some random story that you impose on a project. And that's the same process you employ whether you are designing a new building or whether you're critiquing an existing building. The same mode of engagement you employ. So I hope that answers your question in terms of something that can, so it's not a framework, it's just a way of practicing in a sense. Yeah. So I love projects, design thesis projects, which are district courthouse. हाँ पोस्ट ऑफिस तो अभी नहीं है मगर district courthouse, a town hall and administrative like for municipality, a police station, a fire station, a local government school, because these are foundational community institutions that regardless of what religion you are, regardless of what caste you are, all these social ills that separate us, regardless of how much money you have, you all need these institutions. And wonderful thesis projects come out of it. I always keep telling all faculty I meet that we have to return thesis projects back to human institutions, social institutions that keep us together, rather than global institutions of art galleries and coffee shops that sound wonderful, but and are very coveted even as practitioners, but they matter little, and sometimes they undo a community, like we saw in the High Line, rather than strengthen it. So these are questions only we as faculty can bring into the studio.
Yes. Yeah. So we have our design chair, Professor Ranbir. He'll come here so you can.
Good afternoon, Shubra.
Hello.
Ranbir Mudliar, I teach at MSA, Mysore School of Architecture. Yours was a very refreshing talk.
Thank you.
You normally expect what extremities like, the project is 30,000 square meters. We went up 25 floors, 30 floors.
Yes.
The cost was 500 crores, But you took, like small elements of interesting projects.
Yes.
And you converted them to poetry. In fact, you even mentioned it, the poetic, usage of these elements. Like the first project of yours, the two curved walls of Anand Raje with mud and mirrors.
Yes.
And you added the poetry to it about, the beautiful tree that formed a roof over it. It was really beautiful. It just transported us. I actually felt that I was standing there. By the way, are you related to Anand Raje?
Yes, he's my father. So
He's your father? Oh.
so this whole way of practicing through the way storytellers operate, which is always seeking relationships, come very much. I mean, I owe a lot to him, of course, because we were brought up that way. We used to be curious about the world, not necessarily just architecture, but everything around it that might help us when we embark on architecture. Yeah.
I once met your father and mother both.
Okay.
Must be early 80s.
Yes.
We always go on vacations every 3 months, from Delhi. We used to want to travel somewhere.
Yes.
And invariably, we would say, not Rajasthan this year. And we would go somewhere. Never. We went, every time we went to Rajasthan. After 3 times Udaipur, 3 times Jodhpur, 3 times Jaipur, we decided to go somewhere different. Shekhawati. So Ramnagar and all these small towns. And we had this beautiful guidebook which told us you go 100 meters north, turn right, and then 3 steps and turn left, and this is so-and-so Haveli. So we were doing that, not even looking left or right. So along with us there was a friend of mine, an architect, and he came running in and said, very excited, who's outside? Who's outside? I said, no, I have no idea. So he took me outside, and I saw 2 gentlemen and a lady there. And I said, I don't know. Those are the days, of no internet and no. So he said, that guy is Charles Correa, and the other fellow is Anand Raje. I said, oh, okay, wow, So they smiled, we smiled, and we started talking, and we moved around for some time together and discussing only about the buildings there and all that.
Yes.
But it was a nice experience meeting with both of them.
Yes.
We were friends, obviously.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, that time I think the architectural world was also smaller, and they all sort of, in some way, ran into each other again and again. They all grew up, I think, in professionally together.
So yeah, so the poetry in your explanation was amazing. When you talked about the this what do you call them, the haystacks,
Yes,
and
yes.
the
More
different,
like,
different light
yeah.
is and all that. Again, very poetic. And then the lily ponds and a simple mundane photograph of cows going home. I mean, the Ghoduli you made us. I didn't know the
Yeah.
meaning of Ghoduli until now.
I actually, it came out of a conversation. So that's also what I was trying to, I hope it comes across that all these things that I'm sharing with you came because of my conversations with people.
Yeah,
Um, so we are not repositories and experts, isolated, like a suitcase, we are carrying our expertise with us. That it grows as we become more curious about others and their experiences, and that translates into the way we choose to engage with the situation we find ourselves in each project.
right.
And rather than being in a hurry to become very certain about what the project is, so that then I know my scope, you allow yourself to be a little open. And I think working with students, that is something that will become the most challenging, I find, at least in my experience, because students also want a certain certainty, because otherwise they're always a little uncomfortable about, but what is my project going to be at the end? Will I have something to show? But how to sort of allow them to say, if this method is followed, you will have something at the end.
It's good to be open with students, but you showed aspects of being closed. When you took your twin classrooms and you know
Yes.
you
Flip it around.
closed
Yeah.
it up. You enclosed the courtyard.
Yeah, that whole project, it's another story, but it was constantly a strategy of how to do more with little that the client gives you. Because most of my projects are always where they are not where there is a lot of resources one way or the other, because normally they're always in some form institutions where clients themselves are, um, they always mean well, but they don't always have budgets that allow unnecessary flourish for the sake of it. So sometimes I'm lucky, I find because the clients themselves impose a sense of restraint because of their own limitations, rather than clients who say do whatever you want to do, and then you find that restraint, which sometimes is the most difficult. Um,
I've also been very fascinated with low cost housing and low cost systems.
yes,
Fascinated,
exactly.
very challenging,
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
You remind me of one of my heroes, the economist E.F. Schumacher, who wrote "Small is Beautiful."
Yes, absolutely. But I think currently that is the sort of um, uh, urgency, of our profession. It's almost we have to find restraint on behalf of our clients, um, because the clients always want to do bigger things, because it's a way for them to project themselves and their worlds, and we have to somehow find the restraint, uh, because we know building activity consumes a lot. So I've always, the most challenging part of the profession is how do you bring all these sort of aspects and reflections to the students who are just embarking on what they're.
Well, the bigger the projects, the more the fees for us. So,
Yes.
there are many more things, but I'll
Yeah, we must meet in Mysore now
come over some.
and
Come on,
continue conversations.
we'll do that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your time.
I think if any of no, I think we can close the session now because we've gone a little beyond the
Yes,
time.
I apologize. I am
Yeah, I
talking.
think I'll end the note. It was wonderful, Shubra. It was so nice. It is like, I traveled along with you. I mean, as Ranbir said, and I was remembering all the, the Germany trip that I made, and those kind of there on the huge walls. I mean, when I saw it, it was like amazing to see the kind of work that they were doing. I thought it was maybe for expressing their frustration sometime, or it could be so many other things. First time we were being exposed to those kind of things, and I think the way you narrated such simple things so interestingly, it was like putting us to sort of like a mother telling a story to a kid. I think that is the kind of the journey that you took us to. Wonderful.
That was the I think that was my task, no, to sort
Yes.
of introduce
Yes.
the aspect. No, I'm kidding.
No, no,
We-
no, but
I do take
very true.
some.
No, I'll tell you what, as I think even Sophia mentioned, sometimes we lose track because of our patience, or another thing, the time schedule that we have to complete certain task. Academics, we tend to like, come on, like let's follow the submission deadlines and things like that. I think this is the way you have narrated those design and things like that. We would love to have you in person in college, not only for faculty, I'm sure even for students, they will
Sure.
love you. Okay,
Yeah,
and
of
I think
course. I
we
love
should
to engage with
sit
students.
as a student with you so that you can give us the task for us to write down a poem or a write up, and the way we narrate to you, so that it's a journey for all of us and an experience. Thank
My
you
pleasure.
so much,
Anytime.
Shubra. Really. And thanks to Sophia also for suggesting your name and things like that. So, from Mysore School of Architecture, wholeheartedly we thank you and all the other listeners who had joined in and things like that. Our own faculty, I think our day is like, made today.
Well, I'm very glad, and yes,
Yes.
I'm
And
available anytime anyone wants
yes.
to engage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.